Thanks, Omar and Leslie. Oh, yes, lighting. Now everyone can fall asleep. Thank you, Omar and Leslie. It's a great honor to be at Cooper Union. I just want to underline what Leslie said, that it is a really special school, and it's rare to be in a place where you are fully in sync with their mission of, I forget how it was put, but civic betterment and lower free tuition, I think, is a direction we should all be heading in. And I'm glad Cooper has been holding up that banner with minor interruptions for such a long time. That was a great introduction, because Omar saved me a lot of trouble of saying, like, I edit Paper Monument and then there's other things. Now you know all that, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about DME, which is separate from Paper Monument. It's a series of publications that I'm doing that started with, as Omar said, the Daily or Adjunct Commuter Weekly. But I got a tenure track job, so I had to resign the editorship of Adjunct Commuter Weekly, and I started publishing the Daily Gentrifier. People often ask me what DME stands for, so I'll tell you it stands for Transparency and Integrity in Publishing. This is kind of the DME roster, and can you see the cursor? Oh, you guys can't see the cursor. Anyway, so left-hand side there are some projects that I've completed or half completed. Adjunct Commuter Weekly, which collapsed after 1 week because the adjuncts couldn't continue to provide content at the rates that they were being paid in addition to their adjuncting work. And then that became ACW, which is the digital platform for Adjunct Commuter Weekly, which you can find at adjunctcommuterweekly.com. And then Unter is in development, but that is the opposite of Uber. And then, just getting going here. Then I started on the Daily Gentrifier, and I'll come back to that, but just so you know, there's Privacy Magazine, which I don't talk about publicly, Object-Oriented Ontology Illustrated, which is self-explanatory, Stand Up, which is a magazine about leftist comedians, Magazine, which is obviously a magazine about magazines, and then on the right-hand side are some kind of identity-based publications, part Ecuadorian, because being Ecuadorian is a very particular identity, and then being part Ecuadorian is like even more particular. And my fantasy with that is that the entire staff will be equivalent with the readership. That's always my goal. And then International Slav, which is a much more expansive, and I think publication with like kind of very vast possibilities. And then Ohio Exile is about having to leave Ohio, which that joke goes over like not as well in Chicago, and so I'm happy to be able to say it here in New York. The Daily Gentrifier came out of working on Adjunct Commuter Weekly, in part because Adjunct Commuter Weekly put me in a situation where I was having to do interviews and profiles and things like that, which was good, and I wanted to obviously bring attention to the huge, devastating adjunct crisis in American universities. But on a personal level, I found myself bored and somewhat irritated with the kind of halo that was forming around my head about being like the adjunct martyr or the adjunct with difficulties who was kind of speaking from that position, as a person and embodying that character. So one day I was just walking down the street I used to live next to Nostrand Ave, Nostrand and Atlantic, and I was just walking down Nostrand Ave, and I just thought, oh yeah, well, gentrifier would put me in a completely different kind of position, and there wouldn't be that halo. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that project, and I guess the last thing I'll say just in general about the DME publications in general is that, as you can tell, I'm often imagining a demographic which, under some other system or of living, might actually just have a publication, but the kind of comedic gap or whatever it is because in this system there are obvious reasons why that demographic either wouldn't want to identify itself or couldn't be coalesced into a consumer group that would reward publication or whatever. So I operate in this funny in-between zone, playing with some of that. So one of the mistakes I'll just correct that people have about these projects is that there's some kind of satire, and I don't know if I understand satire correctly, but I don't think there's satire because I'm not trying to exaggerate or poke fun at something. I'm really just, as Omar quoted me saying, trying to fuse different things together. So with Adjunct Commuter Weekly, it was about making visible this huge thing which is generally invisible because of people's shame around being adjuncts, and that shame is useful to people in power. So that was about making adjunct life visible in the style of a lifestyle magazine. With the Daily Gentrifier, it's a little bit different because the shame is actually deserved, and the shame of the gentrifier is deserved, but it's nonetheless, I think, worth excavating and exploring. And it came partly out of my irritation with this kind of aesthetic, which we could go into later, but includes, minimalist fonts, 19th century fonts, subway tile, the color green, all kinds of, like light green, the right kind of green, all these kinds of aesthetic things that are put up to cover up something which is actually a very violent and disruptive process that we're all totally familiar with. We just kind of tend to avoid thinking about it or don't know how to talk about it or something like that. So that's kind of the territory that the Daily Gentrifier is entering into. And as Omar mentioned, the first one I did was a 22 by 30 hyper-artisanal publication, because part of what I wanted to explore was this kind of elevation of the artisanal that happens in these gentrifying spaces where coffee is artisanal and everything is like this fake artisanal thing. And I just sort of wondered about what that means and why that's being recuperated now and for whose benefit and all that kind of thing. So my own very dumb idea was to, well, I should say actually, I'm not a good computer person. So initially I was like, I'll just draw the magazine first, because that's the kind of stupid idea I'll have, and I'll just lay it out like as a drawing, because I was trained to draw and I know how to draw. And then at a certain point I was like, oh my God, no, it'd be much funnier if the whole thing was drawn like letter by letter in this hyper artisanal way. So that's what I did. So what you're looking at now is a little, it's probably like this big in real life, section of the front page of the New York side called Condo Report, which is about this project that my friend Aaron Gemmel does called Condo Report, which, don't Google it now, but later, when you're not Googling things, or you're not supposed to be paying attention, you can Google it. It's a very comprehensive photographic record of the utter boredom and just repetition of condos in New York. And Aaron moved to Philadelphia because of rent, and I was like, let's report on Condo Report moving to Philadelphia. So this is an interview by Justin Lieberman of Aaron Gemmel, and then this is a hand-drawn version of one of Aaron's prints. He did this great series of prints on plexiglass that are, those viewing windows that they have to put up at construction sites in New York that have to be like 17 inches apart or whatever it is. Aaron pulls monoprints of those things. So this is a drawing of one of those. So this is just to give you an idea of kind of what the hyper-artisanal side of it means. And this is the first drawing, and then I got a little bit further into it and laid it out. So you can see this is like a piece of Reeves BFK for the paper aficionados in the room. And I'm a printmaker to some extent, and so I just thought like, oh yeah, I'll use this Reeves, it's a nice color. And I didn't realize it was the worst possible paper to draw on because you can't change anything. And I had to like razor things out. It was a nightmare. But this gives you an idea somewhat of how it's laid out. So you can see, you know, I'm just very simple and put in the big title and the headlines. And then I arranged all the pieces within that, you know, kind of, I wanted obviously to refer to old broadsheets, which would be put up in public space to talk about what was happening. And, you know, so I was envisioning this both being wheat pasted, which is kind of an ongoing thing, but also being held in this extremely awkward way by gentrifiers as they read this big, awkward, light-colored object in public space. Maybe just a note about the bottom here. Those are ads, and in most of my publications, I just give away the ads, so the ads kind of reverse the logic, and I try to think about like who in this alternate universe where this publication was viable would be wanting to advertise. So we have, going from left to right, Black Women Artists for Black Lives Matter, which is an organization of artists, self-explanatory, I think, from the title. What Was the Hipster, which was an N+1 book that my friend Mark Greif published, so I like gave them an ad. Unter, so I gave myself an ad. And then Crown Heights Tenant Union, because I think tenant unions are one of the best direct means of addressing this. And then a group called Gentrifiers Anonymous, who actually, like, I thought I would interview for this publication, but they didn't reply, so I just gave them an ad. And then Rent is Theft, which is like a kind of anarchist, anti-rent organization. So just to talk a little bit about that. And then just to show you a little bit of like the layout, how it developed, I would like print things out and then put them on there. This is like, so like painters in the audience are like, yeah, that makes sense. And graphic designers are like, that's crazy. That's not how you do it. That's how I did it. And then this is like what the finished drawing looks like. So, you know, as Omar said, I was playing with this refined fine print idea. Some of the other taglines were like organic, locally sourced, crafty, artisanal, you know, so I'm playing with all these visual markers of gentrification and obviously trying to kind of turn them around. And then, of course, the idea is if you actually read any of the content, you realize that it's not a kind of covering up kind of content. It's more of a kind of expose content. So in the first East Coast edition, we had Christopher Glazik, I misspelled artisanal there, sorry, wonders if artisanal is just a crafty term for white laziness. So that's this headline here, WPT, you know, white people time, question mark. And that piece was about how, you know, like when white people take a long time to make your coffee, it becomes more valuable and you pay $6 for it because it's been sitting there and dripping down and very artisanal. And that's, of course, that kind of transvaluation is only available to certain groups of people. Ayanna Moore questions the label gentrifier as it applies to a queer black woman. So I was at a dinner party one time talking to Ayanna, and she was like, hold on, you know I'm like a professor and I'm in this neighborhood, but I don't really feel like that term sits very well to describe me. So that's a piece talking about that. Alexander Dwinnell reported on ICE raids that were happening and worker resistance to those raids that was happening at Tomcat Bakery in Long Island City. And this was the situation where ICE went in and said they were going to just start deporting any workers who couldn't produce documentation of their citizenship status, residency status. And so Tomcat was just going to fire everyone, and they fought back and got a severance package, and it was this very tense situation, which of course is obviously connected to the headline here, which is landlord-in-chief builds wall. So, I was trying to make, in my own way, connections between the fact that we basically have like a racist real estate regime in power in the government, and then that has already been practiced for decades in New York, as everybody knows, and everywhere, but was also being enforced in terms of the border wall, ICE raids, all these kinds of things are all aspects of gentrification and racist kind of corralling of people. William Powhida reported on artist studio affordability projects, long-term advocacy for the Small Business Job Survival Act, as spearheaded by Jenny Dubnow. So this was this piece reporting on the kind of boring, grueling day-to-day work of trying to get changes in legislation that help people have longer leases, have more power in relationship to their landlords. And it's this place where artists and local residents who were there before the artists actually have shared interests. So I wanted to report on that, and it's something that people in the arts generally just don't want to go to boring meetings and stuff like that, but some people are out there really working and working sometimes for decades on these kind of questions. So that's a piece about that. Aruna D'Souza reviewed Hilton Alls's Alice Neal Uptown at David Zwirner. I don't know if some of you guys saw that show, but it was a show about when Alice Neal moved to Harlem. She started painting all these people of color. That work isn't as well known because when they do the big Alice Neal retrospectives, they don't tend to show the work about people of color. So it was this interesting thing, also because it's coinciding with the gentrification of Harlem and that kind of thing. Justin Lieberman, I told you about that, interviewed Aaron Gemmel, and then I profiled Torkwasi Dyson's real estate journey to Jersey, where Torkwasi kept getting kicked out of apartments in Brooklyn and eventually went to New Jersey. So just to give you a sense that, all the pieces are these kind of more or less serious, non-satirical reports on all kinds of aspects of gentrification brought together, in the format of a newsprint, or a newspaper, I should say. And then on the backside, so these two things were fused together because I wanted to, on the one hand, show how this was a local phenomenon, and of course connected to this whole idea of marketing the local and valorizing the local, which of course doesn't always make sense, and is usually, that valorization is usually in the hands of powerful people. So certain kinds of being local don't really matter. Like I usually joke, like it's good for vegetables, but not necessarily for people to be local. So I wanted to deal with that localism thing, but I also wanted to show how this was a vast, global problem. So my first solution was to just do New York and LA back to back. So this is the West Coast edition, which starts up at the top with a piece of reporting about Mariachi Plaza, which actually is where a lot of the mariachis live, and they live there, and you come there and you can like commission a mariachi band because you go to Mariachi Plaza. But of course, as soon as Mariachi Plaza got a train line in LA, the developers wanted to take it over. They started tripling rents, things like that, kicking people out. And actually this was put out in the middle of a tenant strike, rent strike, against those efforts by landlords. And the tenant strike was successful. And by having a tenants union and a rent strike, the mariachis and other residents, current residents of Mariachi Plaza, were able to negotiate I think it was a 7% rent increase, which is still like way above inflation, but way better than 200 or 300% rent increase. So that was actually a success story, and there have been some in LA. The middle piece I'm going to actually read from a little bit later. That's called Hipster Settlerism by Kesu Park. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later. There was also an op-ed from Nizan Shaked about this question of whether the picket lines that were put together by residents of LA neighborhoods against different arts organizations which were moving into those neighborhoods, whether those picket lines should be observed, right? And some people were making the argument that, well, it's not an actual labor union strike, so it's not an actual picket line. And Nizan made the point that now that real estate speculation is an industry that is in a lot of ways replacing manufacturing in the United States, those resident strikes are tantamount to a union strike, and therefore, if you believe in not crossing picket lines, you should also not cross those resident strikes. So that was an op-ed, and then at the bottom, there was a piece called Border Wall Proposals by Farah Karapetian, who's a great photographer. And it was actually a pretty straightforward report on the insane architecture proposals for the border wall that Trump requested. And you might have seen some coverage of that. You know, they were just literally, it's one of these things that you don't need to exaggerate. Like one proposal involved burying nuclear waste under the ground as a deterrent. Just crazy things. One also was like also going to be a solar farm at the same time, as if that was like somehow redemptive of the border wall project. And then that drawing you see is actually another one of my attempts to draw an artwork and hyper artisanalize it. So that was a meme made by this person that goes by Social Practice Mafia. I don't know if you, later when you're Googling things, you can Google Social Practice Mafia. They're really funny memes made by Daniel Spalding. And so I took one of Daniel Spalding's memes and made it into a pencil drawing. But it's this thing, I forget what I should remember that it's a 19th century painting of the very industrial space where they're like the iron workers loading in. Some art historian in the crowd will know what I'm talking about. They're like loading coals into the fire and pulling out the glowing metal. But then the text that's all on the top is all about how like cool nonprofit space. Oh yeah, we're splitting the rent 7 ways. We're gonna run 5 video pieces on Commodore 64 computers and blah, blah, blah. And it's obviously like about these kind of unwitting gentrifiers who have moved into this industrial space and are turning it into an art space. And of course, later it's gonna turn into an expensive restaurant or condo or something like that. So just to give you kind of an overview of those pieces. So this is what it looked like printed. So that drawing that I did was made into a digital plate, and then plate was letterpress printed on very thick, unfoldable paper. So when you buy it online, it's very awkward to mail and to collect. So I won't go into all this, but this just gives you an idea of some of the language. Omar read some of that that I use around the project. And the last thing is that the price goes up $10 a month. So it started off as $40, which was like about at cost, and then it was $50, $60. So I don't know now, I think it's like a lot of money, 160 or something dollars. You can still buy one. I'd be happy to sell you one, but you've probably been priced out and you should have gotten in when it was 40. So I'm going to read, just to give you a flavor for some of the texts that are in here, I'm going to read a bit of hipster settlerism. You don't have to read along, you can, but I'll read it out loud for a bit so you get a sense of like what some of the content is. And I chose Hipster Settlerism by Kesu Park because in a way this is like the anchor piece. It was like the most condensed version of what the entire project is dealing with. So Kesu writes, has there really been no public outing of hipster settler aesthetics yet? You must know what I'm talking about. Haven't you noticed the appetite for frontier looks, including native appropriation, which has taken over urban public space? It converges in denim shirts with a Western feel, neon-colored indigenous, quote, inspired design, leather fringe, and the occasional feather in a headband, all frequently on view in a coffee shop in a recently gentrified neighborhood called Outpost. The point is basic and overripe. The ugly foundational history from which tastemakers draw for this trend is one in which the migration of Europeans in search of a homestead led to countless indigenous dead, the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of Africans, the destruction of thousands of pre-existing political orders, and the disposition of over 2.2 billion acres of indigenous land. The dream of the West, the stoic woodland cabin, and the little house on the prairie, we still live with the shape this history gave to the American economy and its racially divided society, though most of America would just as soon forget it, and on some level clearly has. This is pre-election, actually, I should say. But on another, it clearly has not. We are immersed in a full-blown obsession with folksy frontier Americana. The art world and popular culture alike draw cachet from employing visuals that evoke simpler, supposedly bygone times, and the encounter with the wild simplicity of an unspoiled natural world that supposedly entailed. Look around, especially if you live in an urban center where capital is highly concentrated and artistic types abound. You will see pale-faced young men cultivating handlebar mustaches and full beards to go with their gingham and calico button-up shirts, old-time tailored trousers, and perhaps inappropriately bare feet. Navajo print is the choice for t-shirts, coats, blankets, bar upholstery, socks, and underwear everywhere you look. Flip through a local magazine, eavesdrop or run into one of those one-of-a-kind hobby and decor boutiques, and you will get a sense of the current popularity of homebrew, moonshine, and cheese cultures. The enthusiastic return to artisanal arts of pickling, jellying, and wood carving. And just maybe you could get in on the in-the-know trading of sourdough starter from the Oregon Trail. Let me not fail to mention the ubiquitous fondness for moccasins and beadworks and cabin porn, as well as the occasional teepees that preside over an urban garden and skate park in Williamsburg and campgrounds in Marfa, replete with an American flag over the bed. Portland, Austin, I don't mean to leave you out. Oh, I get it. We are over the glorification of mass production, tired of goods made by factory machines. We want things to look idiosyncratic and hand-painted, to taste different with every batch. And we want people to recover an appreciation for the lost or rapidly disappearing worlds of craft. We want to see the handprints of the maker sunk into the material of the good. We want to escape the concrete jungle of the city to a place in the woods near a swim hole with a fire pit and not another structure in sight, unless it is a hotel with a real stone fireplace and antlers on the wall. We want to remember how it feels to split kindling. We want things to look humble and old. Never mind the irritating escapism of these strategies, the irony of plunging into a commercial culture that works by plucking the harpstrings of fantasies about pre-commercial times. To be clear, this is not anti-capitalist, not only because its prolific commercial variations are fed by a haunted and anxious consumerism. No, even those who choose to live, quote, off the grid, without electricity, who bake their own bread and tan hides, especially when everyone in their company, or all but one, is white, ought to realize that the aesthetic they cultivate harkens back to the very colonial seedings of capitalism in this country. What I really want to underline is the amnesia that this country nurses about how settlers came here to establish markets linked to the European economy, about how as they spread out, they spread disease, destroyed ecological habitats, lied to, stole from, and killed Indians. This country was not depopulated and, quote, won by formal troops, but by these first folks in search of the American dream. They amassed unimaginable wealth by expropriating this continent and importing African slaves, which still underwrites the gross surplus of resources that the U.S. enjoys. This form of dispossession took place across the whole geographic range of the present-day U.S. So you can now pick the variety of frontiers person that calls most to you, depending on whether you like the woods, the coast, the mesa, or the plains. Maine trapper, Portland logger, plantation belle, cowgirl, and more. The legacy of that term survives in how the word pioneer remains the highest of compliments, and talk of frontiers is supposed to excite us. While hipster settler aesthetics are not quite the same as an embrace of genocidal racism and the violence of settler colonial capitalism, they are, any way you slice it, an embrace of the denial of these things. The history is not difficult to access and not confusing. Public oblivion, for this reason, looks like a choice not to know. And with an awareness of the history, current trending taste look like deep nostalgia for an age of proud white supremacy. Again, this was written before the election. More honestly, we might say that this phenomenon is about ancestry. While the trend has become general, another complicated story about the mechanics of consumer culture, the consequences of historical amnesia and colonial longings, it is no accident that it is most dearly cultivated and beloved by white people. It remarkably issues, as, let's admit, such aesthetic fads hardly ever do, from white American heritage. It seems no accident that this aesthetic and the arrival of the, quote, artists who wear it like a uniform constitutes the sign of the continuing marching border of gentrification and the displacement of poor people of color in every American city. The historical reference is not vague and general, but precise and elaborate. The parallel geographic displacement and replacement of the moment make these aesthetics practically a citation of the past. Why this intense aesthetic expression of nostalgia for the days of conquest? Why now? Is it backlash at a moment when the radical racial turmoil rooted in this history of indigenous dispossession and African enslavement can neither be celebrated by white supremacists nor quite imagined away? I mean, we've obviously moved into full-on celebration at this point, but does the weight of denial bear too heavily at last on the present? I don't know, but here is what I hope. That these pantomimes, which are, after all, one way of engaging with the past, will occasion a real confrontation with it. Heaven knows it is high time. So I should say, maybe this is a good time to say it. I was in the middle of making this project when the election happened, and probably like the rest of you here, I didn't really think that Trump would win. And initially, you know, maybe some of you also experienced this. If you're in the middle of an artistic project and then there's some other kind of calamity that's heavier and more direct than the kind of things that you're thinking about, it probably inspires a period of reconsideration. And I initially felt like this isn't going to work anymore. Like this is an emergency, and I'm not responding to the emergency, right? Like I'm sure a lot of you felt, but maybe this is self-delusion, but I eventually started to think, no, making these connections between the direct, so one of my headlines was about Paul Manafort, like a long time before he was indicted. It's like the third headline here. Former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort real estate purchase raised Russian money laundering questions. It was like the first moment where that was happening. So, as I worked more on the project, it became clear to me that this landlord in chief thing was actually very true. And, the Kushners, the Manaforts, all these people are, neck deep in New York real estate gentrification, and now they're applying those methods, on a national scale with ICE and with all the Muslim ban. All those things are kind of outgrowths of this attitude. So I started to feel like actually it was a relevant kind of response. This is me reading at the release. So this came out in September of last year, so it's about a year ago. And just to show you, this is Kay-Sue reading her piece in LA. Obviously, part of the project is to distribute it, send it around to people, have talks like this one, have conversations, try to mobilize or, affect people's outlook on these kind of questions. So just a few pictures of this. This was at the public school in Chinatown in LA. We had a reading. This was a staff meeting. This is Tracy Jean Rosenthal and Farah Karpetian. And I guess since we're talking about disciplines, Tracy Jean is more of an art writer and journalist and creative writer, and Farah is a photographer. So I try to involve a lot of different kinds of people, activists, designers, painters, printmakers, writers, critics in the project. Not just because the heterogeneity of the piece benefits from that, but also because there's a kind of social feedback loop where when people work on this project, they then report back to their communities about the project, and it ties people together and makes kind of social connections that I think are the main point of the project. I was filling out a grant application last year where you have to, you just check off different kind of boxes, and I never know what boxes to check off, but on this particular form, I think it was for creative time. Nonfiction was one box, and then public art was another box. So I was like, I do nonfiction public art. And that combination made sense to me because it was like meant to go out into these various publics and be distributed in that way. So just a note about that. This is the legendary designer Chris Wu admiring my design skills, because Omar was asking me before the talk, like, do I have design skills? And you can judge. I don't have computer design skills, but I like to arrange things. So yeah, this is the look of shock from Chris. This is David Sr., who some of you might know, who used to be here in the library at MoMA and now is at SF MoMA. And David bought the Daily Gentrifier for SF MoMA, and it was, I never got the photo, but I think it was supposed to be displayed at the Public Knowledge Gallery at SF MoMA. And obviously, like, one of the points of this project is that it addresses the artistic community and addresses them in the places they go. So I'm very pleased if it goes to a museum or a gallery, because then people encounter it and kind of have to, reconcile themselves with this publication. This is me. You can't make it up, So this is a restaurant called The Gentry in Brooklyn that we stumbled upon after the release party. Yeah, in Williamsburg. This is the poet and critic Raphael Rubenstein, who I ran into on the subway when I happened to have a bag of the things, and Raphael struck a very good pose to show you kind of how big it is and kind of its floppiness. So to show you what it looks like as an object. Yeah, and then so sadly, Gentco bought the building and the company, and I had to put out a press release about how Gentco was now just using the Daily Gentrifier to sell T-shirts, And then, so they just take this accumulated cultural capital, and they wanted to turn it into a t-shirt business, which I tried to explain to them was like a very bad way of expressing the ideas, and nobody would want these gentrifier t-shirts, but Gentcode went ahead with that anyway, so they were trying to sell these gentrifier t-shirts, and I moved to Chicago. This is actually it turns out this is the Ohio State one, but so now a little bit more briefly, I'm going to talk to you about the next phase of the project, which is Flyover Flyer. And I'm one of these, I always start with the title. So like, I got this idea for Flyover Flyer, and it struck me that a lot of the things that were very familiar and intense to me from New York and what I knew about the West Coast were also happening in smaller cities in what we call flyover country. And so being positioned in Chicago and being invited to give a lot of different talks in these different schools and arts communities, I realized I could start making these flyover flyers. Also in part because I knew I didn't want to make a big hand-drawn print ever again in my entire life. I wanted to make something smaller that could be distributed. So this is the Columbus Flyover Flyer, which just came out like 2 weeks ago. To give you an idea, you can look at it later, or you can even get one from me if you want. So, you know, the question for me in taking this on was, could I establish some kind of national, and actually I'm going to do international too later, but some kind of national network of publications that would consolidate people's thinking on this question and bring them together in ways that were disruptive, inspiring, soul-crushing, I don't know, just different ways of combining this material. And it was partly a way for me, just on a personal level, to deal with coming and giving a talk. I would give these talks about the Daily Gentrifier in a smaller city, and I realized very quickly that people that were very into that project, they'd come up to you afterwards and talk, and you get to know them. And I love working with other people and bringing them together. So it was a way for me to kind of put together these small staffs for each city that, again, would, you know, there's usually, I was telling Omar earlier, it's like a kind of like a jazz ensemble. Like I have to, it might be a trio, it might be a quintet, you know, like I have to figure out who's going to do what and how the group works based on who wants to be in it and, you know, who I think is interesting to work with. So, you know, there's usually like a kind of designer, kind of journalist, maybe a poet, fiction writer, artist, I don't know, curator, different kinds of people that want to get involved. And it's been very interesting for me to kind of be like, okay, you know, I'm the band leader, and how are we going to play this here, and what matters here, and, you know, all these kind of social and artistic questions change based on the location that we're working on it. So, and another dynamic is that in smaller, some of you may be from, you can't all be from New York, the center of the cultural universe. If you're from a smaller city, you know that the art worlds there are far more personal and intense, in the sense that, like, if you say something bad about someone, you're going to see them like on Friday, you know, like at the other opening. Like there's no outside, there's no other group to go. And so, you know, this is also kind of an interesting thing when you start to bring up the awkward and, you know, aspects around gentrification, racial politics, class politics, funding. You know, people don't want to talk badly about an arts organization that funded their last thing or had their show or is cool in a certain way, but maybe not another way. So, you know, this is something I'm learning about and trying to figure out with the staff in each city how to deal with. And then obviously there's the aesthetic question too, of me wanting to like hit the particular aesthetics of each place's gentrification in a way that resonates with the place. So those of you who've ever been to Columbus, Ohio know that that's a really funny place to start, because like Columbus doesn't have an aesthetic, it's not even, it's kind of a made-up city that was made up for like insurance agents and the university and state government, right? So it doesn't even have the like big crumbling industrial sites that Cleveland has, or there's no kind of identity formation around those kinds of things. And so my designer on this, Rye Wharton, was like, yeah, you really picked a difficult one to start with. So, but it was actually pretty interesting to try to get into like, okay, what is the aesthetic of gentrification in Columbus? So we started to realize it was based around real estate maps, real estate flyers, and mall maps. Because like Columbus is America's test city, that's what they call it, because it's demographics is like, you know this from elections too, right? Like how Columbus goes, the whole country goes, and they always test things in Columbus to see like how it's gonna go. So we came up with this design, which features the Easton Mall map up here and the typeface of Easton Mall, and then flyover flyer, and then we kind of embedded the content into this setup. So this is the front page here that you're looking at on the left, which includes a great essay by Danny Marcus called "Breaking Labor's Utopia." I don't have time to go into that, but it's a great piece where he talks about, in Columbus, a lot of the neighborhoods are not even ethnically identified to the extent that that kind of defensive organizing would work, as has worked in LA, where Mexican-American neighborhoods have been able to say, no, like this is our neighborhood, we're gonna stick together and protect it. In Columbus, they were talking about how it's like, well, it's the near north side, like does anyone even like identify with the near north side? Like it's just not like that. And so that kind of conundrum inspired Danny to write an essay about how the defensive politics that most anti-gentrification projects are working on is not really a sufficient program for really dealing with the problem, which I think is a really great point, and kind of Columbus's particular situation brought that out. And then on the inside here, where you see says flyover, written in all the names of the new condo developments in arts districts in Columbus, saying flyover flyer. I did an interview with this collective called Mint, which was this interesting case in the south side of Columbus where they took over this old meatpacking building and were kind of successfully running a lot of arts programming, had studios. It was a huge 17,000 square foot space, and it really filled in a genuine cultural need in Columbus, bringing a lot of people together, showing new art, all this stuff. And then when Ghost Ship happened in Oakland, a lot of you might remember when that space burnt down and people died, nonprofit spaces all over the US were suddenly descended upon by fire departments and inspection people from the city and everything like that. And that closed Mint down. And the interesting thing, and why I wanted to report on it for the Daily Gentrifier, was that other spaces in Columbus that were in developing neighborhoods were not similarly like coded to death, right? And that's, I speculate in this interview, that's because their eventual survival was not really about culture surviving. It was about a real estate project and getting the real estate project to the next step, from working class neighborhood where people of color are living to where artists live, to condos and malls. And that's why like things would be protected. And one of the great ironies that everyone talks about in Columbus is that the arts district doesn't even have any artists or arts galleries or anything. It's just called an arts district. It's just like the most naked, just like name it an arts district, develop it along those criteria, but there's no artists even involved. So that was the interview on the inside. And then the last part of it was the flyover flyer literary supplement. So I'll show you that. And then I'll just read very briefly to end from James Payne's novella Goodale Park, which is this thing here. So just to give you an idea of another kind of writing that the Daily Gentrifier publishes. In her memories, Europe's great parks, Friedrichsburg Gardens, Parc des Bouches-Chaumont, Kuna Park, even the Tiergarten, had been havens for wine and the young, who sat and drank in circles that inevitably intertwined and played out across their lives. But the Columbusites of Goodale Park, whether young or old, were bent on depriving themselves of these public pleasures, as long as it meant the unhoused wouldn't have any pleasure at all. Therefore, Goodale Park, her park, was shorn of underbrush, so one couldn't fuck, patrolled by police, so one couldn't drink or smoke, and unrelentingly surveilled by a panopticon of neighbors, so even the pups, who in Athens and in Berlin had played peacefully untethered, were chained to this community inhibition pact. Hyde Park had its free speech corner. Gezi Park had its own spring. Lincoln Park had screamed, "The whole world is watching." And Zuccotti Park had said to occupy everything. But at Goodale Park, the Columbus Police Department had fined even her white college friends from the Vegetarian Cafe Benevolence, gone now, of course, when they briefly cobbled together a chapter of Food Not Bombs to feed the poor. The commerce outside the park had been as sterile as the life in it. Havana, Exile, the Plug Nickel, Blazer's Pub, and all the other heritage gay bars that defined the neighborhood had closed their doors, while, as if by some perverse transitive property, her straight friends' sexual repertoires opened. Like a war trophy, the straights outside the park now fetishized the acts they had long jailed those in the park for performing. Getting her ass eaten was now de rigueur, and utterly absent before. Poppers, bathroom fucking, fisting, pegging, sex work, anonymous online hookups, and G were trends that ran through her friends like seasonal colors, normies possessed by actions that haunted the park's environs, whether or not the rough trade and hustlers still did. Her life looked more like a Mapplethorpe exhibition the more the leather bars turned into beer gardens. It was unclear, really, what actual use the park still held for the people of the city, though she decided Goodale did still have a use value. It was just that its use value laid in how pumped up the ever-ballooning prices of the property immediately surrounding it. Ownership liked how they assumed future owners would like the view, and so they viewed the park in those terms, visual. Anything that sullied the picture they envisioned potential owners would desire was soon erased by a neighborhood commission, a police detail, a park attendant, or by one of the other hundreds of shareholders awaiting dividends from the city's most dependable asset. Anticipation of future owners, marks really, of a more middling type, had already turned the rest of Columbus into Theseus's city. No part of it had remained the same except its name. And the one aspect in need of change, Columbus, was now simply a shared hallucination coalesced around a specific GPS coordinate, a staging ground for capital, populated by transient workers searching for a living and owners in search of life to exploit. These new inhabitants, Columbus 2.0, she called them, were not attractive or ugly. They had no attributes but existence. She could see them in space and recognize their reality, but there was no sense in which she felt called to human relationship with them. She could just as easily not have been there, or they not there, and neither of their lived experiences would change. When she regarded them in space, she did not see individuals, but animate iterations of the same representation of capital perversely mediated, she thought, by some tyrannical artist who employed human lives as a material to make some statement about banality for some patron. They were like fields of pine trees planted to be felled at Christmas. They were Christmas trees at a Christmas tree farm, and she and her few remaining friends were storage units, she decided. Her body, was it not a storage unit? Not that she was a Cartesian, no. It wasn't that she was a bag filled with self-propelling bones and held her mind like a relic in a reliquary. But what was the Midwest and her being of it and still in it, if not storage? Her friends all seemed locked in storage, in stasis, waiting until another polis called them up with opportunities for money or money through sex, or sex through money. No, stasis wasn't quite right, she thought. A force did act upon them. Entropy. It flattened their faces, spread their necks and cheeks, thickened their sides, dulled their wits, lowered their ambitions, and regressed their tastes and expectations to a mean. Okay, thank you.